why don't we start with a little bit of prayer, because in some way that's where Andy ends. So let's start there. So let's pray. God, we give you thanks that we can gather together, even if it's virtually. We give you thanks that you might be present in our midst in ways that we had not before imagined. And we ask that your Spirit would be opening our eyes to see you, opening our ears to be able to hear each other and to hear your word, and to be able to open our hearts to be moved, to understand who we are in your grace, even deeper ways than before. Ultimately, God, we ask that you would open our hands so that we might serve your people in this, your world. In Christ's name, amen. Okay. Well, thanks for coming. For those who are just joining us, we had a little conversation. I'm in the middle of some transitions, so it's been a little bit of a chaotic week. I'm currently coming at you from the Byward Market in Ottawa, where and not a minute before coming on, we put a bid in on a house. So things are moving around me a little bit, so maybe not as focused as I should be. And so I'm relying on you to help out a little bit with that. So that's my excuse today, or my explanation. What I hope that we might be able to do is that we've got Andy. You can see him there in his monastic cell in the basement, waving at you. And he last week sent me a sound file, which at least 51 of you who have downloaded the video have seen or potentially heard. And I edited what he said. I said, Andy, can you give me 2 minutes? And he said, no problem, and then sent 12. And so I edited it down and took the first part and the last part and put them into the two different videos.
But you would pay me more if it was longer.
Yeah, exactly. I will double what I'm giving you right now, Andy. I will double it.
Double of zero is still zero. Yes.
Exactly.
Blair, you clearly haven't oriented him to the culture of Canadian Presbyterianism.
Yes. No, he doesn't know. You can't. Well, he's kind of Malawian. Like, they tell you to come and preach, and like in Canada, if you were to get invited to preach, it would be like 12 minutes long, 15 minutes long. When I would preach in Malawi, they'd say, well, we've got an hour reserved. Is that enough? And I'm like, yes, that's definitely enough. We can work with an hour. So Andy's Malawi. It's like, I said 2 and he said 12. It's great. So what I'd like to try to do is, if you guys have any questions that have surfaced, I know that I've got at least one email. If you surfaced any questions in your mind that you'd want to ask Andy directly, we can do that. And then we'll transition into, I think the answer that I cut out deserves some discussion, and so that Andy can start thinking about it. It was really around some issues around multiculturalism, and in some ways in which Taylor, and then moving forward, Jensen or others who are maybe working in a different context than we are, and but also since we've started this, the United States has erupted in terms of its racial relationships and ways that civil disobedience is playing out in that, and it's a large cultural moment. So Andy worked some of that on his musings, which were not final, but there were some thoughts about that. So we'll move to that, and then we'll end with looking ahead, what are some of the things that we can anticipate in the second part of this book? Does that sound fair? So we'll go questions, talking about some multiculturalism and culturalism in general, and then moving to the final part. Does that sound fair? You can just give a thumbs up, or I saw a few nods. Great.
Blair,
So,
we're having some trouble with your audio. I don't know if you have any like a headset near you that you could use. Okay.
So can we go into breakout groups? And what I'd like you to try to do is, if you're going to ask a question, let's try to get it succinct. So in your breakout group, work with a couple of people to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of asking, and ask it, and then see if you can get the question to something that's relatively succinct. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so go into breakout groups. You've got about 3 minutes to get your questions nice and tight.
Great. So everyone should be back now.
Great. I don't think we need to do a big introduction, but you can see Andy. He's at least for me up in the left-hand corner. He teaches in Minnesota, which in a couple minutes will be interesting because it's kind of one of the epicenters of the sort of racial tensions in the United States. He teaches at a Lutheran seminary and has done so for quite a number of years. Teaches practical theology, youth ministry. Those are the kind of things that he does. And he is a prodigious writer. So there are a lot of books by Andy. A lot of them, they develop an Andy universe, I suppose. The idea of secularity and then how it intersects with our own personal identity, but also how we relate to each other and how God acts in the world. These are ongoing themes. So I'm sure if you asked him a question about something that's not directly in pastor and secular age, it may be a little bit unfair, but I'm sure he could likely deal with it. He's a big boy. And many of us on here are Canadian, so are by definition and default nice. So, well, and apparently, according to Andy, if he doesn't answer the questions, it's my fault. So if you listen to the videos, so yeah, no greater love has a friend than that. He'll let somebody say crazy stuff and then have to take the blame. So do we have any questions for Andy to start off with?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Andy, good to meet you via Zoom. My name's Brian Fraser. I live out on the West Coast in the presbytery where Blair used to be before he headed off to Malawi. Our question really focused on where in all of the frameworks that you presented us with in this book, where and what's the role of collaborative leadership?
Well, that's a really good question. Nice to meet you. And yeah, collaborative leadership. I mean, for me, I think overall, I think the projection of my whole project is to think that there's something essential about collaboration as really core of what the church is, of what it even means to be a human being is a fundamentally kind of collaborative relational reality. So I think that would be a major core element. It doesn't come out really in part one, and it doesn't come out because I'm trying to use these quote unquote ideal type pastors. Again, not the best pastors, but for good or for ill, the kind of pastoral imaginations or the pastoral forms that have gotten caught in our own DNA, I think, in North America in some ways. And they weren't always collaborative. I think, you could make some assertions that Jonathan Edwards was kind of collaborative, though he was pretty much leading his people to follow what he had to say, or they're all going to burn in hell. And it would be really hard, I think, to think of Beecher as kind of collaborative. He was the upfront kind of stand-up comic, and in some ways it would be hard to think of Rick Warren, I think, as having kind of collaborative leadership. There's a collaborative team doing things, but there is a kind of whole movement there towards a professionalization at a lot of staff levels that are leading things, which I think had some, and still does have, some pretty significant cultural relevance. That's maybe not all good, but serves a certain cultural role. I mean, my wife is a Presbyterian pastor of a small church, and she was just lamenting yesterday how, especially coming off the back end of this pandemic, trying to talk about doing some kind of vacation Bible school for the kids, and finding a program that was going to be Zoom, but also things in the home, and then asking people on session to who wants to do this, and like no one raised their hand, and everyone was exhausted. And I think post-pandemic, or in the midst of this pandemic, a lot of churches are at that place. But I think we saw the beginnings of that even 2 decades ago, which led to huge staff-run churches where the pastor had to do more, and the pastor had to hire professional people to do more, because people just didn't have time or energy or desire to do a lot of those things. So, pushing us forward, I think collaborative leadership will be huge, especially at the level of involvement with lay people, getting them involved in the ministry. But I do think we're going to have to make a theological commitment or argument for that. And by that, I don't mean sitting down and drowning them in a dogmatic argument, as much as having a kind of operative lived theology of our sense of what it means to belong to one another, of what it means to be in the world, that will mobilize that more than, because I think the days of like guilt, you should, if you care about this institution, you should do stuff, are kind of over with. Which is one of the reasons Rick Warren, was a genius, in the sense of build a big, huge infrastructure that met all those consumer needs to keep people going. The problem is I try to draw a line of not being too hard on any of these people, and also be critiquing them. And so it's really easy for me to beat up on the kind of mega church movement, but there's also some ways that they were quite on point on seeing some of the cultural changes that were happening and responding to those. And I think it actually forms a lot of bad practice, but it was there for their desire to do good things. And one of those was to be a really strongly driven staff-run church. Has all sorts of problems unless you can get your budget up to $2 million, $5 million, $27 million, $50 million. You can't do that. All of a sudden that becomes the frame of ministry. That becomes a really hard, painful, almost dead end kind of thing. But it was a response, I think, to the loss of some of this engagement. So I don't know, Brian, if that gets directly at what you're asking, but that's some of the thoughts I'd have at the beginning. I think going forward, collaboration will be a really big thing.
It does. That's really helpful. $5 to $27 million churches are probably not within our denomination's social
Right.
imaginary. But no, that's helpful. And I'm assuming that some of that more communal, collegial, collaborative stuff comes into the church book, into volume 3.
It definitely will. Yep, it definitely will. And that book is going to be called The Congregation in the Secular Age. So it will really push into that.
To it.
Yeah.
It's been a provocative read.
Well,
at some point we'll have a longer conversation about it, but thanks so much.
Yep. Thanks for the question.
Are there other questions? Thanks, Brian. You have to know that for those who don't know Brian is really big on jazz. And if you don't know jazz, then I'm sorry for you and the loss in your life. But it's also it's the metaphor that Brian uses for a lot of things, but certainly the collaboration that happens between musicians to produce something is something that is important there. Are there other questions? Yeah, Paul, I see your hand.
Actually, just carrying on from the last question, because it's dovetailing some other work I'm doing. And I'm not to spoiler alert for your next book, but will you be talking about, or is it something looking at engaging lay leaders and how they become part of the realization of God in our world and how we bring them into our community of faith or of leaders?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I want to say every project that I've been about and will be about after this is trying to lean into that in many ways.
Right.
The next project, the way it will unfold is it will stay with Taylor, but it takes a kind of turn from Taylor to give you the kind of preview of what's next. And there's been a really interesting, I wouldn't call him a collaborator, but he wrote his dissertation on Taylor about 15, 20 years ago. It's a German thinker by the name of Hartmut Rosa, which I think is really worth knowing who he is. He's very well known in the German-speaking world, which makes me seem like I'm somehow very cosmopolitan and cool saying, but I stumbled across him from a friend, and he wrote like I said, he wrote his dissertation on Taylor probably in the 90s, but since he's built off Taylor, but he's really written about modernity and what modernity does to us. And he's got two big books called Accelerated Modernity, and then the second book is called Resonance. And his whole point is what modernity is, building off Taylor, is the continued speeding up of certain structures of our lives. So it's obviously the speeding up of technology, but it's also the speeding up, which is really kind of interesting in the moment we're in. It's the speeding up of social change. And then it also becomes the speeding up of just the pace of our lives. Mm-hmm. And he is kind of a critical theorist. So he thinks there's more than a little bit of a problem with this continued speeding up. Not only do you have certain ecological issues and economic issues with the continued speeding up, but we've seen across the West, just huge issues psychologically as well. And so he thinks it leads to certain forms of alienation. So the second book is this thing called Resonance, where he thinks that what we're dying for in modernity, and I think that the church can play a part in this, and I'm trying to put the kind of an ecclesiology or the church in conversation with it, is thinking about action as resonance, as this connection, this deeper form of connection. And it sounds a little fuzzy right now, but it's really interesting how he works it out, and what that actually means and how it connects us. So the third book kind of takes this route of warning us that some of the ways we try to solve issues of the congregation actually speeds the church up. And we think that if the church is going to survive, it needs to be able to go faster to harvest more resources, whether those resources are more programs or more people, and that we can actually end up doing something we can end up hurting more than helping in that. And then we really need to think about the church as being a place of resonance so that people feel actually connected to one another and to the world. And then I try to give a more theological kind of understanding of that. So
that sounds exactly like what we just read in your book about God being present in the events and in the absences of our life. Sounds like resonance.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's kind of building that out and trying to shift it more into the congregation than just maybe the event of pastor and other person, to try to think of it a little bit more communally.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, Bahati. Yep, okay. Oh, you got muted again somehow. There you go.
At the video, and for me, secularism is I thought about Matthew 28:19, when Jesus gave an order to his disciples to go and preach the gospel in the world, at the uttermost part of the world, and to form disciples, to preach the gospel, those who believe, to baptize them and to teach them. I think as leaders, we are called to multiply ourselves for us to be able to bring many people in church. Because if we don't multiply, how the church will survive in this this situation, the hard situation we are living in? We have to delegate others to do what we are doing. Not the job is not for ourselves. Our members have to know that they are called also to preach the gospel wherever they are, and to bring many souls in churches. That what I understood when I had the video.
So I have a one thing that I was thinking. I think this relates in some ways to Brian's question, Bahati. So I wonder when we say something like everybody needs to preach. I think that everybody would go, oh yes, everybody needs to do something. But at another time, I wonder whether or not that idea also plays into what Rick Warren is trying to do. In some ways, it might be what Calvin was doing a little bit as well, which is to make everybody, if everybody is equal, then everybody has the same job. Like Calvin saying, there is no privileged ordered status to a monk. They're not more spiritual. They're a monk or a priest is the same spiritual level, and he doesn't do it by bringing the monk or the priest or the nun down to the lay level. He pushes everybody up to the priest or monk. So now we have the priesthood of all believers. Then when we get to Rick Warren, what we see is the professionalization of the priesthood. And so now, are we really asking them to be priests, or are we asking them to do a job unpaid? And that's, in some ways, not a rub on what Brian's saying, because he's trying to say, no, we need to understand leadership in an entirely different way. Because if I'm just recruiting people to do what I'm paid to do because I need to multiply it, then I'm not actually offering anything different than what Rick Warren is doing. I'm just creating a vast group of unpaid staff. Does that make sense, Andy? Do you and then what does that mean for evangelism? Is I think partly what Bahati's getting at. If we expect everybody to be unpaid professional staff, what are we doing for evangelism, and how does that change the shape of our community?
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, that's one of the most captivating things about Taylor's whole argument, is that he's trying to say, which I think is hard. I tell people it's depressing to read A Secular Age because it's 700 pages, but then it feels like you have to read it 3 times before you really understand it, so it's quite a task. But it's what brings me back to it and keep reading it is this way that what you would assume isn't really what happens. So for instance, like Blair was saying, the only way you can get to the kind of secular age that is happening across the West, the kind of secular age in Canada, where belief is optional. The only way you can get that kind of world is because it's born off the back of a world where people really, 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 really wanted to believe, which is really fascinating. So the ground is tilled to have a world that doesn't believe only because it comes as a child or grandchild of a world that really, really did believe. So you have a whole kind of Reformation perspective where the bar is raised for everyone and everyone has to be a priest, and all of a sudden certain things can happen where the bar can be completely lowered. And now it doesn't matter, as Taylor says, I think so beautifully, it doesn't matter what you do, it matters how you do it, which particularly and the Calvinist nations was really important. So it didn't matter if you were really the priest, but if you were going to sell buttons, that was fine. You just had to do it in this faithful way, in this passionate way towards, as a reflection of your election or something, that you would do it. And those are very different forms. And I think your point is a good one, is that there's not a recovery. We like, particularly in my world where I work with a lot of Lutheran students, like the priesthood of all believers gets flashed up there like a bumper sticker all the time. And it's a theological statement that's never really defined or unpacked, and everyone loves it. But it is we haven't been precise on what we are actually mean when we call this the priesthood of all believers. Because I think you're right, Blair, especially in the backside of an age of authenticity and in a consumer society, and in churches that are run, or the ideal churches are run like small businesses, it's not really giving over to the people the sacred means of grace, like the scriptures and like the sacraments. It's help us run the institution, help us all pull on this rope as the institution is being pulled by the gravity of decline, pull on the rope to keep it from going down to decline. It's a very different, if you will, kind of eschatological horizon of what the church is and how the church includes people. It's a very different kind of collaborative leadership, I guess, Brian. If it's like, we need you to keep this institution from declining further and going away, as opposed to this, we need you to find your way. Like you feel the calling of the Spirit to find your way into participating in what God is doing here. And we need to gather to reflect on that, to interpret that, to discern that, to find ways to pray with the world and for the world as God moves within the world. It's a very different kind of frame than that. But I think one of the things that happens in this kind of secular age pastorally that Rick Warren represents, and I don't have any empirical research on this, but it's just a hunch. And I think I float the hunch in this book, and I float it in another book I've been working on. But I tend to wonder if particularly mainline pastors feel more disenchanted than even their people do. That we almost feel a little bit more like we have to protect ourselves from feeling like we're more irrational than others. Like if you talk to people in your congregation, they have more stories with divine realities or answers to prayers or believe in weird poltergeisty things than a lot of, you'll find, mainline pastors who feel like they want to, at least in the declining kind of cultural sensibilities of their vocation, they still want to hold some legitimacy to it. And you can almost find that people will believe, people are less fragilized, if we use Taylor's language, almost within our churches than some of our pastors themselves. And I think there's some good reason for that, some very compassionate reasons for that. But that is a really interesting thing to try to wrestle with. And I think particularly in mainline churches, and I think with a lot of my students are almost more secular than, functionally secular than, more, let me put it this way, they're more invested or willing to affirm what Taylor would call a closed spin to the immanent frame, as if there's only natural material things, than some of their people. Their people still kind of live with more of an openness to that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I see Keith. Let's go with Keith. Bahati, we'll come back. Let's go with Keith. He's got a. Oh, you're not unmuted yet, Keith.
No.
There you go. Oh, somehow you got muted.
There we go.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by what Andrew just said and about congregations and pastors. And I'm wondering if it has something to do with changes in theological education. Because I know when I was in seminary, now this is like 55 years ago, all the professors had been pastors for 10 years. It was almost a criteria at Union Seminary in Virginia that before you could be a professor at the seminary, you had to present yourself as having been in a congregation for 10 or 15 years. So what I knew was that some had graduated. They'd been pegged when they graduated as top of the class, and they were going to go on and get PhDs. However, they had to put in their time in a parish. And so my recollection is that every professor that I had was saying, I understand what I'm doing. I'm helping to prepare students for being pastors in a congregation. And so out of the 50 in the class, now maybe 2 or 3 would end up going on to graduate school and be the next generation of professors. But everybody else understood they were going into a pastorate. Now, have I said enough to say that there's room here for you to make a comment?
Yes.
I think that's changed. I think
yeah.
That today, I think theological education seminaries tend to often have people come as professors who have expertise in a particular area, but have not had themselves pastoral experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, I think that a lot of seminaries and people who are running seminaries and things like that are aware of that and aware of the divide between theory and practice that they don't want to have that's existed, but it still seems to functionally operate like you're saying. And they're just, I'm wondering, I think there is just a very different logic when you ask theological questions from the location of ministry than when you ask them in the location of the university, say. And I think this has been just a legacy of the last 150, 200 years within the West, that this has been the case. And I think you're right. I think that's absolutely true. And the ideas that I'm trying to play with in this book and then continue to push is thinking about how the real task for the pastor is to have to come to grips with how to talk about divine action inside an immanent frame, inside this scrim that we all live with. And I think that's something that's really interesting about Taylor's perspective, is he's saying if you live at all in the West for any significant amount of time, you just take on this kind of shortcut cultural map that gets put before you. And we all have to have these. There's no way to be a human being and not have some kind of culturally imposed shortcut map that you use to kind of figure out your world and to make sense of all the interconnections and relationships in the world. This is just something that you have to do. And in the West, that map, Taylor's point is, it's an immanent one. We presume immanent definitions to things. We presume immanence over transcendence. And that makes it really hard. I think it makes it really difficult for the pastor to figure out how you address the immanent frame, and particularly how you witness to God's action inside the immanent frame. And I think what happens a lot of times in seminary classrooms, especially, we'll be kind of mean or bombastic and say it particularly happens inside the systematics classes and dogmatics classes, is there's a kind of disconnect between the person, not even in the pew, but the person even in just the larger community going to the local grocery store, who takes on this presumption of the immanent frame, and yet also may have these experiences of the living Jesus Christ beckoning to them or calling them, or having to make sense of issues of life and death, or having to make sense of issues of identity and meaning inside of this immanent frame. And I think often there is a kind of disconnect of how do we do theology inside of that presumed scrim that we have. So I think you're right.
Okay. Are there other questions? I see Bahadi's got another one, but let's go with Nathan. He hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet. Hey, Nathan.
Hey, thanks for letting me jump on, Nathan. I'm actually a Presbyterian pastor in Louisville, and good to be with y'all. My question is sort of around the idea that we sort of exported the concept of Rick Warren all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. But we exported him to contexts that don't necessarily have the immanent frame. So I'm curious to hear, but then that comes back in the US or in Canada in sort of multicultural churches, right? Where you have folks living in these, I know Blair, you've kind of touched on that in some of your videos. So how do like sort of those like okay, we have these mega churches and sort of, you know, whatever ideas out there, but then at the same time you have these people living, and if you work like we do in our congregation with any global partners, you have all of that swimming together. I'm just curious to hear some of your thoughts on those realities.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions and interesting thoughts. And so I'll just dive in and probably start contradicting myself, and we can tease that out as we go. But it is a really interesting phenomenon that if you go a lot of places around the world, even other Western countries. So one of the interesting ways to think about this is if you remember Taylor's three seculars of how he understands secular one, secular two, secular three, and I think. I have an essay coming out in a festschrift that was done for Douglas John Hall, where I try to put the Douglas John Hall, the United Church, and McGill professor in conversation with Taylor, which is kind of interesting since they were both at McGill. But one of the things that I try to flesh out in that essay is that if you think about the secular one, secular two, secular three, and if you think secular one is the clear divide between the public and private. That's the way kind of Taylor understands the first arrival. And the way these seculars work is that once they arrive in a society, they're there forevermore, and then they can become secular two and secular three. But once they're there, and they always kind of come back as well. So if secular one is this divide between public and private, so you in a sense, like after the Enlightenment, you don't need the person who's running the local institutions to be necessarily a believing person. Like faith becomes a private matter. And if you think about it in that way, you can make an argument that America is the most secular of the Western countries, because America from its very founding has the clearest divide between the public and the private, the separation of church and state. And like compared to say the Scandinavian countries, which have and even England has a very fuzzy secular one. I mean, we still have the Queen of England, who is the head of the English church. Like there's a blending, and there's still an echo of the ancient regime in these days of kings and queens, which America is just a very weird place, like especially compared to France, that our revolution actually sticks, where the French one, they need 3 tries to actually get the republic to stand. And our states, but it leads to this kind of illusion, this actual delusion that we just created, I'm talking about Americans here, that we just created ourselves kind of ex nihilo, and we have no connection to the ancient world. We have no connection to the ancient regime, really, that we just kind of formulated and created ourselves. I always tell Canadians this. I once flew into Kelowna, in like from Seattle up to Kelowna, then went through customs and went, little customs in Kelowna, and there was the customs officers, Canadian customs officers, and a picture of Elizabeth was behind them. And as an American, it's like, what the heck? Canada, I thought I knew you so well. Why do you have this picture of the Queen up? But of course, that makes complete sense. You're Commonwealth, but for an American, it's just, there's a complete cutoff. So you can make the argument that America is the most secular one country compared to, say, the Scandinavian countries. But what that's meant, as this is unfolded, is that America has become the least secular two country. And by secular two is fewer and fewer people going to church, the religious institutions being fewer and fewer people going to them. So America, in some sense, is to more than other, like Taylor will even call this the American exception compared to the rest of the West, of how religious participation is held on. Now we've seen that drop even in America. And if you control just for mainline congregations, you see something very similar to the rest of the West, of this major drop off. But what that's meant is that America, to become the least secular two, and therefore to have these institutions with more people in them, you had to create a continued crisis. There always had to be a crisis. And the crisis was, if we didn't really, really care, if we didn't really invest, if we didn't really innovate, then fewer people would go to church. And what's happened across the rest of the West, like say in Australia, say in Canada, say in the UK, is that they have become you all have become the most secular two countries, even though you're the least secular one. But those secular two forms, like Rick Warren's, have been what's been exported to the rest of the world, even though now we're all in secular three. and particularly those like Scandinavian countries are in secular 3 in the sense that all belief itself becomes fragilized. But what gets projected to the world and sold to the world are kind of mega church forms, which really are directing a crisis, not a crisis of belief necessarily, but a crisis of participation. Now, what's a really interesting phenomenon is how that crisis of participation can, and we're just going to use this as an exploratory thought. Maybe I'll not believe this later on, but the way that crisis of participation takes certain consumer forms, and for some reason across the world, certain Pentecostalisms have been able to link on to certain American forms of consumerism. There's been a certain ability. I don't think that they fuse. I don't think they're the same thing in any way, but they're somehow able, like a Lego, like offset Legos, to connect enough so that you will find across the world more people reading Joel Osteen than would be ever reading Stanley Hauerwas. I mean, there's obviously bigger reasons for that, but part of it is that that fits, or more people have read Rick Warren than have read, say, Eugene Peterson. You know what I mean? Like that he becomes more formative. So there's some way that the crisis of secular 2, fewer people are going to church, plays in to another, I think, more spiritual crisis that often maybe people feel even outside the West, of something being at stake, if that makes sense. And I think there's more to explore on how that happens, but it is quite amazing that you'll go to a huge Pentecostal church, say in Hong Kong or something, and they find out you're American, and they'll tell you that they've been to Southern California and been to Saddleback for their conference, or been to the Willow Creek conference or something like that. And again, I don't want to disparage that. I just think it's a really interesting phenomenon. The only last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm on a roll here, but is that there's something about what Taylor means by the Nova effect within this, is that what the Rick Warrens, and we do, I think, as mainliners, have to honor their genius enough, even if we feel like it got linked up with consumerism too much, to be able to respond to this exploding of these third things, of the recovery of spirituality in the late 20th century, but now a spirituality that was completely self-directed, that was completely free of classic religious forms or classic forms, that they were able to respond to that the new religion of even of self-realization, they were able to speak to that. And I think there is some connection to the kind of Azusa Street, a Pentecostal movement that finds its way in that same kind of Nova effect. I don't think it's the same thing, but I think it plays within that. So I think there's interesting work to be done connecting some of that. And I know there are some scholars who have looked at some of it. That's a long answer, Nathan.
No, that's really, really helpful. We're in Latin America a lot, so I was thinking of some of the neo-Pentecostal, and they're not even just mega churches. They're like over multiple countries, right? Like there's a site in Brazil and in Mexico, and then even in the US somewhere. And it's like, how does that, yeah, that's really helpful and really interesting. Thank you.
So could we transition a little bit? Just trying to be aware of our time a little bit. Because I think that last question ties into something that we had discussed at our last webinar a little bit, and that I had posed to Andy, which revolved around the idea of multiculturalism. So I think that one way somebody put it in the group was, there are more Presbyterians in Ghana than there are in Canada. There are more Presbyterians in Korea than there are in Scotland. Just for the record, there are more Presbyterians in Malawi than maybe both of those places put together, but whatever the case. And so when a Malawian, not that many of them do, but when a Malawian comes to Canada, they'll find a Presbyterian church. And so they're sitting beside somebody who is heavily within secular 3, and they're coming from a context in which Presbyterian in Malawi or Ghana or Korea, in most cases, is not in secular 3. And so you've got, within one denomination, or what we would think of as a denomination, you sort of have some warring visions of what is normal and what God is doing. And so how do we make sense of that as a pastor? Like that's one of the questions. I'm getting an unstable message. Am I back again?
You're back. Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think that it relates also to the other side of American exceptionalism, which we're seeing a lot of now, is that it's not that a place like Canada doesn't have racism, but we have it in a much different way than America has had it because of history. I don't think that we need to say that something is less, like, I don't want to get into saying Hitler is worse than Mussolini. Like, it's not like racism is bad across the board, but I think it's likely a different beast in Minnesota than it might be here in Canada. And there may be something that's illuminating about that. But what wonder, Andy, if you could just talk about a little bit about this idea of multiple cultures coming together or not coming together, and how they might be in conflict, and whether or not there's something that's going on in America where not only are you being called to reconcile with a horrible, evil past, but also whether there's different visions of who God is and what God is doing in this moment, and whether that's changed over time. That the secular age is like this is getting compared to 68 a lot, and you think that 1968 is kind of a pivotal year in terms of I get my books mixed up, whether it's in this book or whether it's in the next book, but in terms of changing. But there's a bunch of stuff, Andy. Can you make something out of that?
I'll try. 68 is important. It's actually important in the yellow book, the Faith Formation in the Secular Age. Yeah, which tries to trace the age of authenticity and how authenticity are kind of driving moral norm here. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I would say about this blue book, The Pastor in a Secular Age, I do have a deep kind of unease about the way part one can be read or could be assumed, because you do, I guess it's really hard for me to say, like, well, Augustine is just a white dude. I think it's hard to say that. He's an African, completely, almost 2,000 years ago. So, but besides that, these tend to be some kind of Eurocentric kind of people, and I was really aware of that, and so try to continue to remind everyone that by ideal type, they're not the best. It's just for good or ill, they get lodged within our perspectives, and tried to have more diverse voices in part two. Part of the problem with that is they become really kind of significant and heroic voices. I mean, you get Dr. King, who I think is significant, and you get Howard Thurman and others who play a significant voice, but you don't quite get as much of just maybe everyday people, and I think that's a problem with the book. When it comes to kind of thinking about, there's big conversations about how, like, Taylor's perspective plays within. Like, Taylor has like no reference really to colonialization or colonialism in really any way, and so he's been critiqued for that. And I think he would say that his argument is alongside those. It can make sense of that, but that's not kind of the framework he was working in. But he probably could have had more kind of references. And he's trying to say, I'm trying to tell you the larger story we've lived under, and maybe it's even been oppressive at times. But I think it is an issue. I think it is really interesting to, like, read Willie Jennings' book, Theological Imagination, under and alongside of Taylor's, or maybe even alongside of this. And I'm trying to work with his stuff more in some future projects, because one of the things that I think Jennings makes a really significant argument that is at least convincing to me, and that this can be, he doesn't do this, but it can be mapped onto Taylor and Taylor's sense of this movements from the ancient regime to the age of mobilization to the age of authenticity. And he's trying to show this idea of kind of whiteness and blackness is embedded even in medieval forms, that the Spanish king and others have a kind of sense of that. But it really does become significantly mobilized, obviously, during the slave trade and things like that. So mobilization, that fact that you can mobilize yourself around the country and can take over. And he thinks that gets linked onto a very, not necessarily a bad theological idea, but a bad understanding of where these Western countries rested in a certain theological story. So instead of seeing themselves as Gentiles, they saw themselves as Israel. So instead of always seeing themselves as strangers in a land not their own, and therefore having to be welcomed and having to have a more humble disposition, they saw themselves as Israel, who was coming into a land that they were promised. And he says, that theological problem leads to a whole lot of our issues of colonization and things like that, at least the theological justification of it. The only other thing that I'll say, and I'm just rambling as much as your question was, Blair, I say in love, but one of the, kind of thinking about Minneapolis here post the riots that have happened here and how it's been worked out. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how this all flows and what's written and thought about this inside the pandemic and how that played, and really in some really significant, important ways, the reckoning that's going on. The one thing that I worry about, and I think that kind of comes right into our own pastoral imagination, is how you start to separate. And I don't know if America has the will to do this, to be honest, but how you separate or how you recognize a lot of this as historical. It's a historical reality, like you were saying, Blair, but it also continues to feed off certain forms of neoliberalism. This idea that the way you stabilize a society is through growth, and always constant continued growth in an economic way. But one of the things that's happened since the invention of social media sites is that neoliberal sense of continued and constant growth has been projected into the tools people work out their own identities. And so there's almost a neoliberal sense of what Hegel talked about and Taylor talks a lot about, and what Taylor calls the politics of recognition. And he's saying, building off Hegel, that there is this sense that if you're going to have justice, you have to be able to recognize people. People have to be recognized. There has to be a recognition. So this is what he means. He has a little book called Multiculturalism. That actually is a really good read of a few lectures. And he talks about this, and that, people who want their distinct identities, whether they are from an ethnic community or whether it's a sexuality, whatever that is, they want recognition for that identity. That's completely legitimate. You can't have justice without some form of recognition. And what's really happening, at least in America, is there's a huge move for actual recognition. And you can't undersell how much that shifted just in 3 weeks of huge corporations coming out and basically stating with, well, not basically, directly stating with commercials like, we recognize, or even the Southern Baptists coming out and saying Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter isn't just a political movement statement necessarily. I mean, it has that, but it also is this assertion of, we have been unrecognized, and if there's ever going to be justice, there has to be recognition. That is all good. That all has to happen, and the reckoning that's is happening within that is huge. The question just becomes, when you put that and that gets glued onto a social media neoliberal, always growth, always more recognition, more and more and more, and there's no other moral horizon to that than just getting more likes, more recognition, more followers. When does this start to turn on itself? And then you do. So for instance, I'll just say this and maybe you'll hate me for it, but when the Southern Baptists came out about 3 weeks ago, and the president of the Southern Baptists said at no less than 6 times, Black Lives Matter, we as Christians this has to be important to us. Said it 6 times. You read the Twitter feed, and particularly white middle-class ex-evangelicals had horrible things to say, like, I can't accept this. This is awful. Never. This is just insulting phrases of this, because in some sense they have their whole identities built on the opposition of that institution not learning, always being evil, always being bad, getting recognition as you oppose it, as you tweet against it. And for it to learn and to grow and actually enter into confession all of a sudden makes your identity less viable or less worth social media recognition. And all of a sudden you can never move to reconciliation, but you just have competitive neoliberal battles over who gets more recognition. And so, I mean, Blair knows this from a paper I presented when we were together in South Africa. I'm quite a big fan of the Tutu Mandela kind of stuff that happened in South Africa, and it's not without issues. And there's a whole nother reckoning going on with what happened after that, particularly economically. But the horizon of reconciliation and of the sense of kind of theologically personhood and personhood mattering, which does echo back to Dr. King, which is why I always have a lot of resonance with Dr. King, because he's a personalist and he has this anthropology of personalism, does give a different moral and eschatological horizon than just, I need to be recognized. People who aren't recognized need to be recognized. Well, now they're getting recognition. The problem is that recognition is not, it's finite. The eyeballs or interest or concern can only be on certain people at a time. And so you enter into competitive battles, and that becomes what I worry about. And I think post this, we've seen in so many good things, in so many important articulations of the need to recognize each other and recognize populations of people who have not been recognized. But we also need, and I guess this is where the church fits, we need a deeper moral horizon than just recognition to the nth degree without any direction of where it goes. And that's what I worry about.
Right. No hot button issues at all in that response or anything. So now that it's all clear and you're all clear, we can recognize that Andy is awesome. Let's just keep on moving. In some ways, we will have to do that. We don't have all day, but I think one of the things that we can see, at least in that answer, certainly, at least in Canada, part of my experience, at least in the last little while, has been that recognition and the language of recognition in First Nations and Indigenous peoples is something that we need to wrestle with. About last Sunday was Indigenous Sunday, and so there are questions around that. And then also, I think in Canadian terms, when we talk about the immigration has to play a part in this, and recognizing where folks are from and how that plays out, and where, how many people have worshipped at a Westminster, a Knox, or a St. Andrews, right? Like this is, we're pretty good at recognizing certain Scottish ancestors, but as I said, we're a lot more reluctant to, recognize Kwame Bediako, who's one of the greatest Ghanaian theologians and a Presbyterian in our church, right? Like we're gonna quote a white guy more often than we're gonna quote Bediako. So I think that there's likely work to be done.
Absolutely. Yep.
As I dig myself into a hole on that, but it's still an important thing to question about. And as pastors, how do we stand at the intersection of this? Both we are like traditionally, at least in the Presbyterian tradition, not that everybody here is, but I think everybody here is Reformed in some ways, even my UCC brothers and sisters. But is, the preacher is the one who's recognized standing at the front, and so how do we how do we configure a pastoral identity where the preacher isn't the only one that's recognized, but somehow God becomes the one that's recognized in the midst of people, right? And that's, I guess, the segue to go to the final part of this book, which is where Andy ultimately is going to go, which is perhaps the most radical thing that this has been his radical argument from the start, from his very first work, is that God does show up. Like, this is the crazy part, that secularism can't see, but that somehow this Nova effect opens up the possibility that God can show up. And in previous work, Andy would say God could show up in a particular kind of relationship, that there's and it's very Christological, which may be one of the things that our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, it's not an accident that Andy uses neo-Pentecostal, which is pneumatological language. Like, so there may be other ways of recognizing God, but Andy's way has traditionally been a very Christological way, but has really recast that. And so Andy, I wonder whether or not you want to, not everybody's read part 2, and as they get into part 2, what kind of things should they be looking for, or what are you hoping there?
I'm going to give you a shorter answer because, sorry, Blair, I do have to run in just a few minutes. I have another appointment in a few minutes, but so I feel bad about that. But yeah, I mean, this is what I hope that you see with Taylor, is that it does open up the challenge of how do we point to what I call divine action, or how God still acts within the world. And yeah, so the 2 steps that I try to take is, first of all, like Blair said, that God still does act within the world, that even that even living in an immanent frame does not exclude God. We wouldn't really have a God who is God if God couldn't act even in a modern, late modern construct. So God still acts, but it does lead us to have to kind of have an imagination for how this God acts. So yeah, I try to make this argument that God is first and foremost event. And what I mean by that is that not that God isn't a person or a personal agent that encounters us, but that it always is an encounter itself, and an encounter, well, we'll just say it that way, encounter with a personal agent that's God, that we feel God coming and speaking to us, that God arriving in the form of some kind of relational encounter. So I think one way to think about transcendence, and if Taylor's point is transcendence gets pushed out, that one way to think about transcendence is to think about it as a limit, like, in particularly the limit of reason. Like, what is transcendent is outside of what you can know, or what you can reason of your culture or yourself. And if that's true, then we do have an issue, because the whole Enlightenment project, the modern project, is to say, let's not build societies around things we can't know. Let's not build even structures of what we believe about ourselves and one another about what we can't know. And you shouldn't waste much time with what you really can't know, which is very different than our ancestors, but we've created a world like that. But I don't think that's really even a biblical way of thinking about transcendence, and that transcendence isn't just the limit of reason, but that transcendence can be thought of as the encounter with a personal agent that really pulls you out of yourself, and that when you encounter someone who you truly see as other and share in a relationship with them, it feels like it is an experience of transcendence. So I try to give that more theological shape, and I do go Christological, but mainly my Christological interests are one that I just find the Confession of Jesus Christ incredibly fascinating and life-giving, so I'll just own that. But the second piece of it is that I think the way, this is my wager, is the way to start to discern how God is moving has to be dialectical, in the sense that this is a God, and I think particularly inside of late modernity, there's a certain recovery of at least Luther's conception that the first move is to be aware of and even proclaim where God can't be found, where God shouldn't be found. and then to recognize that this God of Israel is a God who shows up in those places. Like when Israel is in slavery in Egypt and all is lost is when God arrives. When Jesus is 3 days dead in the tomb, God arrives and out of death brings new life. That when Israel is in exile, Ezekiel, and God comes to Ezekiel and asks, can dry bones live again? I mean, these become these movements of God coming out of the impossibility. And so the narrative I use is kind of one from Dr. King and during the Montgomery bus boycotts, and him realizing that in his own power as pastor, he could not do this, that he could not lead the people of Montgomery and the people of the South to any end that they needed to go. And this is what he calls his kitchen table experience, where he had this direct experience where he felt like God spoke to him. And God said, Martin, when there's no way, I'll make a way. And in 1967, he preaches one of his most famous sermons, which is called The No Way God, and that out of the no way, this is a God who makes a way. So I want to play with the idea of part of what the pastor does is participate in these no way experiences that modernity does thrust upon us. But in the midst of actually doing pastoral work in the no way experiences, that we have this direct experience of transcendence. So I'm trying to push into thinking about God as a minister, that even thinking of God, if you want to say as a pastor, but to say that God's primary form of action within the world is to minister to humanity, is to minister to creation. And that when we enter into kind of relationships of ministry ourselves, whether we give them or receive them, that we're taken up into something, that we find ourselves in experiences of transcendence. And I think if you talk to most late modern people really across the globe and you say, tell me of a time where God was really present in your life, they will often, not always, but often talk about an experience of either receiving or being given ministry, someone being there for them in their no way experience, like getting on a plane and knowing no one and their mother just dying and needing to go to the funeral and breaking down and crying, and someone standing with them, a stranger, feels like it was the presence of God. So those experiences are what I'm trying to push us into thinking about as people in ministry, that ministry is a really profound and beautiful form of human action, maybe even the strongest of all. But its strength is in its humility. Its strength is in its weakness. And in those abilities to join other human persons and give and receive ministry, we're taken up into a divine reality. And helping our people understand that, to me, seems to be the kind of heart of the kind of collaborative perspective that Brian was getting at, is if we can give people visions for going into the world, and maybe this goes to the evangelism question too, of being moved out into the world to both give and receive, to testify and proclaim God's ministry in the world, and to participate in that. That I think that becomes a way of pointing to this divine reality, even in the reductions of the immanent frame, that I think that breaks that open.
Okay. Andy's telling me that you got to get going. It's my fault that he has to go, because if he can't answer, it's my fault. If he can't do it, it's my fault. It's all my fault.
We run out of time. Yes. You saw my 12-minute answer to a 2-minute question, so you knew that an hour was not going to be enough. So we will blame it on you. So, but thank you all. Thanks for reading the book and dialoguing with it and listening to me ramble on in my basement to you. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
As Andy gets off and is on to his next thing, you're going to get some more videos and some more sheets from me, well, from Jen. I produce them, Jen sends them out. If there's ever a delay, it is not Jen's fault. It is always my fault. So don't ever, she's just here. Don't ever blame this one. It's this one. but you should shortly get some videos and some sheets around that. And if you have any questions or comments that you want to make about that. As I think, like you may have seen, I stay at CREEF, which is the Presbyterian Retreat Camp and Conference, or not camp, just retreat and conference center, just outside of Toronto. And we've been having house church because our internet is so bad that there's no such thing as streaming a service. So we've been doing house church, and we've been very happy that we can now do it. And the O'Brien family is there, and my family's there. And so, yeah, my kids show up. It's kind of amazing. But we've been preaching through Ezekiel, in part because of what Eddie was doing, in part because I've been teaching some Old Testament in Malawi. And it strikes me, and it strikes me as interesting. I'll leave this with us, that Ezekiel really does have an encounter. It is an event. And if there's any question, just go back and read Ezekiel 1 and 2. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, it's an event that has a time. As I was among the exiles by the river Kebar, it has a place. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. So in case you think it's just like he's smoking dope or something, he's going to go on, and whoever the editor of Ezekiel is going to make sure that we really know it. So it's going to repeat, say on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Joachim. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kebar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. And my students in Malawi love this because this gives the prophet authority, because God has reached down and has grabbed that. And so they're like, these are definitely the words of God that follows. And so when Andy eventually gets to Ezekiel and working through that, I wonder whether or not it's a good idea to go back and take a look at Ezekiel, whether or not the pastoral identity and the prophetic and having the hand of God upon you is something that we really want, or if it's something that is something in a secular age, whether it's even possible to imagine, whether or not, how does God continue to act? Now, Jen seems to have disappeared. And Chris, you are our host, apparently. So I think we'll end there. What I'd like, you're going to get some videos, you're going to get some sheets, but I've been finding reading Ezekiel in tandem to be a edifying, but in some ways strangely terrifying experience. As I try to figure out who I am in the face of a secular age, but also in the experiences of having the hand of God in my life, and what those might mean for me. I'm getting a text, which likely means Jen is texting me. Her internet dropped and she can't get back on. So you'll get an email from Jen, and blessings on your time and your ministry as you go forward. May the hand of God steer you, but not be too heavy, and as you go forward.